she was just a cashier, working a late shift, tears in her eyes, until Keanu Reeves quietly stepped into her lane. What he said next offered her a way out of the life that was breaking her. But who knew that one simple question would lead to a second chance, and a movement that would change everything? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few dusty cars scattered under flickering lamps. It was close to midnight in this small Nevada town, where things slowed down early and didn't pick back up until morning. But inside the Walmart, the fluorescent lights still buzzed, casting a tired glow over long, quiet aisles. Keanu Reeves pushed a cart through the near-deserted store, his black hoodie pulled over his head, trying to blend in. After wrapping a late-night shoot nearby, he wasn't looking for attention. Just something simple. Dog food, bottled water, and a flashlight he didn't really need. Solitude was a rare gift for him, and places like this, ordinary, unnoticed, gave him peace. As he rounded the corner toward the front checkout lanes, he noticed her. A woman in her early 30s, hair pulled back hastily into a bun, wearing the familiar blue Walmart vest. She was scanning items mechanically, her hands steady even as a tear slipped quietly down her cheek. She swiped the back of her hand across her face when no one was looking, breathing in sharply to pull herself together before muttering a practiced, "Have a good night," to a leaving customer. Keanu paused for a moment, watching. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but Keanu did, and something about her exhaustion, bone-deep and desperate, hit him hard. Her name tag read Valerie. He made a choice in that instant, steering his cart toward her lane even though it was slower. She glanced up at him with a forced smile, her eyes red-rimmed but polite. "Evening," she greeted, scanning the flashlight first. Keanu smiled gently. "Late shift?" he asked. His voice was soft, unassuming. She gave a small, hollow chuckle. "Yeah, you could say that." She kept scanning his items, head down, doing her best to keep things professional, but her hands shook ever so slightly, and Keanu didn't miss the way she bit the inside of her cheek, fighting back something. And then he said it. Just two simple words, but they made her freeze in place. "Rough night?" Valerie stopped moving. Her hand rested on a bag of dog treats that hadn't yet made it into a plastic bag. She let out a breath that sounded heavier than it should have been. "I'm sorry," she mumbled, wiping her face again quickly. It's been a long week, month, year. Pick one." Keanu didn't rush her, didn't press. He just stood there, quiet, giving her space to speak if she wanted to. Valerie glanced up at him again, really seeing him this time. Recognition flickered in her tired eyes but didn't seem to register fully. She was too weighed down by other things. "My daughter's sick," she said after a moment. "Asthma, real bad lately. The medicine, it's expensive, and they cut my hours. Rent's late. I'm trying to hold it together for her, but..." She trailed off, forcing another smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Anyway, you didn't come here to hear all that." Keanu shook his head gently. "Maybe I did." Valerie blinked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. There was no pity there, just understanding. He didn't offer platitudes or awkward sympathy. He just listened. She cleared her throat, embarrassed by how much she'd already said. "Sorry, just ignore me. It's been one of those nights." He didn't ignore her. Instead, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small, unassuming business card. It was black with silver lettering, simple. On the front it read, "Project Uplift." "I think we can help," Keanu said, sliding the card across the counter toward her. His tone remained calm, but there was something in his voice, solid, reassuring. Valerie stared at the card, wary. "What's this?" "It's a program I'm involved with," Keanu explained. "We give people a chance to get back on their feet. Real jobs, support, healthcare, whatever's needed to get a fresh start." Valerie hesitated. She'd heard promises before, too many that led nowhere, and yet there was something different about the way he said it. No pressure, no judgment, just a quiet offer of hope. "Why me?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly. Keanu gave her a small, gentle smile. "Why not you?" She looked back down at the card, her fingers brushing its smooth surface. "What do I do?" "There's a number on the back," he said. "Call tomorrow. We'll set up a meeting. No strings, just a conversation." Valerie swallowed hard, fighting the urge to cry again. This time it wasn't from despair. It was something else. Maybe hope. "Thank you," she whispered. Keanu nodded once. "Take care of yourself tonight, and tell Lily she's got one brave mom." Her eyes widened at the mention of her daughter's name. How? But he was already giving her a small wave and turning to leave, his cart forgotten at his side. Valerie stood there for a long time after he was gone, the business card still resting in her palm like a lifeline. Maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. The Walmart was long behind her now. Valerie gripped the steering wheel of her old sedan tightly as she pulled into the cracked driveway of her small apartment complex. The parking lot was dim, one of the floodlights flickering as if it were on its last breath. She shut off the engine and sat in the dark for a moment, the weight of the day settling on her shoulders. In her pocket, she could feel the faint outline of the card Keanu had given her. Simple, black, elegant. Project Uplift. The words felt like something out of a dream, something shiny and impossible. Inside, the air smelled faintly of the peanut butter sandwiches she'd made for Lily's lunch earlier. The tiny living room was clean but tired. Faded cushions on the couch, a lamp missing its shade, a pile of Lily's drawings held up by magnets on the refrigerator door. "Mama?" Lily's small voice called from the bedroom. Valerie pushed her worries aside and walked toward her daughter's room, opening the door softly. There she was. Lily lay curled on her bed under a thin blanket, clutching her worn stuffed bunny, its ears frayed from years of love. Valerie smiled as she sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing her daughter's dark curls back from her forehead. "You're home late," Lily said sleepily. She gave a little cough that made Valerie wince. "I know, baby. Mama had a long shift," Valerie replied softly. Lily's big brown eyes blinked open again. "Will things get better, Mama?" Valerie's throat tightened. That question had been whispered so many times before. Every time she heard it, her heart cracked a little more. But tonight was different. Tonight, Valerie didn't offer the same hollow promises. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the card. "I think they might," she said, running her fingers over the lettering. The next morning, after dropping Lily off at school and spending a long, restless hour pacing the apartment, Valerie sat at the chipped kitchen table. The card lay in front of her like a challenge and an invitation all at once. She took a deep breath and dialed the number. The line rang twice before a warm, calm voice answered. "Hello. You've reached Project Uplift. This is Anna." Valerie hesitated. Hi. My name is Valerie Thornton. I met Mr. Reeves last night and he gave me this number." There was a pause. "We've been expecting your call, Valerie," Anna replied kindly. "Can you meet with us today?" Valerie's hands trembled. If you're free," Anna replied. "No pressure. We can make this work for you." "Today is fine," Valerie said quickly, heart pounding. Anna gave her an address and explained there would be a car sent to pick her up in an hour. Valerie hung up the phone, staring at it like it might disappear. It was happening. Something was happening. The sleek black sedan that arrived in front of her apartment building didn't belong in her neighborhood. Valerie felt out of place just stepping inside. The driver was polite but quiet. In less than 20 minutes, they pulled into the parking lot of an unassuming office building. It wasn't glamorous, glass windows and neutral tones, but the energy felt different. Anna greeted her at the door, a kind woman in her early 40s with soft eyes and a no-nonsense confidence. "Welcome, Valerie. You've come a long way." Valerie wasn't sure how to answer that, so she nodded instead. They sat together in a sunlit conference room. Anna explained what Project Uplift was, laying out brochures with photographs and testimonies. It wasn't a charity, Anna clarified. It was a support program designed to offer stable jobs, affordable housing, and comprehensive health care for people who had been working hard but hadn't caught a break. "We believe people like you shouldn't have to fight so hard to survive," Anna said gently. "You just need someone to open a door." Valerie's eyes welled up, but she fought the urge to cry. She listened as Anna told her about an administrative role at Tesla. A real job, full-time, full benefits, a steady paycheck. The position was entry-level, but there was room for growth. And it came with something Valerie couldn't have imagined. A housing opportunity in a safe, clean complex designed specifically for Uplift program participants. The rent was reasonable, the schools nearby were some of the best in the county, and healthcare, it was fully covered. Anna handed her a folder. Inside were details. Lily's new pediatrician, Dr. Patel, was already scheduled to meet with them the next day to address her asthma care. I don't know what to say," Valerie whispered. She looked down at the papers in front of her, afraid they might vanish if she blinked too long. "You don't have to say anything," Anna said softly. "You've already done the hard part." Valerie stepped outside after signing the paperwork, standing on the sidewalk as the weight of the moment settled on her chest. Her breath hitched. She tried to keep it together, but it was too much. She sat on the bench just outside the door, burying her face in her hands. The tears came fast, hot and unrelenting. They weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of disbelief, of gratitude so deep it hurt. She hadn't dreamed in so long. She hadn't dared. But now, there was space for it, a future. She felt a presence beside her and looked up to see Keanu Reeves standing there quietly, hands in his pockets, sunglasses pushed up on his head. She hadn't even noticed him arrive. "You okay?" he asked softly. Valerie gave a wet laugh. "No, but in a good way." Keanu smiled faintly. "Good." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Why me?" she asked again. "You could have helped anyone." Keanu tilted his head. "You were there. You needed someone. That's all it takes sometimes." Valerie stared at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she whispered. Keanu nodded. "This is just the beginning. You're going to do great things, Valerie." And for the first time in a long time, she believed it. The sun rose gently over the hills of Nevada, spilling golden light through the windows of Valerie Thornton's new apartment. It wasn't fancy. 2 bedrooms, clean carpeting, and appliances that actually worked. But to Valerie, it was a palace compared to the cramped, run-down place she had left behind. This was more than a home. It was a fresh start. Today was her first day at Tesla. She stood in front of the mirror, smoothing down the blouse she'd carefully ironed the night before. Her hands trembled a little, but it wasn't fear that made them shake. It was anticipation, nerves from stepping into a world she'd only ever watched from the outside. "Mama," Lily's voice called from the kitchen. Valerie walked out to find her daughter perched at the breakfast bar, her inhaler nearby but unused. A good sign. Lily looked healthier already. Her color had returned, and the dark circles under her eyes were fading. Last night, Valerie had tucked her into bed without worrying if her little girl would be coughing herself awake. "I packed your lunch," Lily said proudly, pointing to a brown paper bag. Valerie's throat tightened with emotion. "Thank you, sweetheart." "You're going to do great," Lily said, offering a gap-toothed grin. Valerie knelt down and hugged her daughter tightly. "So will you." At Tesla's sprawling campus, everything gleamed. Glass and steel, solar panels and lush green spaces. Valerie had never seen anything like it. She stepped through the front doors, her ID badge clipped securely to her shirt. Inside, Anna, her Project Uplift mentor, waited with a reassuring smile. "You made it," Anna greeted, walking her toward the elevators. Valerie took a deep breath. "I'm still trying to believe this is real." Anna chuckled softly. "It is, and it's only the beginning." Her job was in administrative operations, a world away from the cash register she'd worked at for years. She was introduced to her team, friendly faces who welcomed her without hesitation. Her direct supervisor, Rachel, was kind and patient, explaining processes and systems in a way that made Valerie feel capable, not overwhelmed. They started with basics: data entry, filing, handling scheduling requests. Each task was methodical, and at first Valerie was cautious, double-checking every step. But as the hours passed, muscle memory took over. She found herself enjoying the rhythm. For the first time in years, she wasn't dreading the end of the day because of exhaustion or fear of what tomorrow might bring. She was working towards something better. Over the following weeks, Valerie's confidence grew. She mastered new software programs and quickly became someone others turned to for help. Rachel noticed Valerie's attention to detail and began giving her additional responsibilities, managing small projects, coordinating meetings, even reviewing budget reports. But it wasn't just about tasks. It was about how she felt doing them. There was pride in her work, knowing she was contributing to something larger. One afternoon, Rachel approached her desk. "I have something for you," she said. She handed Valerie a certificate, an official recognition of her completion of Tesla's professional development program. "You're ready for the next step?" Rachel said warmly. "Have you ever thought about leadership?" Valerie smiled shyly. "I'm still getting used to being here." Rachel shook her head. "You belong here, and you've got a lot more to offer." Meanwhile, Lily's health made steady strides. Dr. Patel was more than a pediatrician, he was a guide. After the initial checkup, he developed a personalized asthma care plan for Lily that included new medications, routine checkups, and access to emergency support if needed. During one visit, Dr. Patel leaned down to Lily's level. "You're a brave girl," he told her. Lily smiled. "Mama says we're fighters." Valerie's eyes misted over as she watched her daughter thrive under care they could never afford before. She no longer worried about filling prescriptions or skipping appointments because of cost. Project Uplift had covered it all. It was as if someone had lifted a heavy weight from her shoulders, freeing her to focus on the future instead of surviving day to day. On weekends, Valerie began volunteering with Project Uplift. She spoke at orientation sessions for new participants, sharing her journey. "There was a night I thought no one was watching," Valerie told a small group of single parents, veterans, and others. "But someone was, and they believed in me before I could believe in myself." Her story resonated. People approached her afterward, asking questions and thanking her for giving them hope. It was humbling, and it lit a fire inside her. Valerie wanted to do more. She helped organize job fairs, partnered with local schools, and advocated for childcare resources. As Project Uplift expanded its reach, Valerie found herself stepping naturally into a leadership role. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was helping others find their way out of the darkness she'd once known so well. One rainy afternoon, Valerie returned home from work to find Lily sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, crayons scattered around her. She was hunched over a piece of construction paper, tongue poking out in concentration. When Valerie set her bag down, Lily looked up and smiled. "I made you something." She handed her mother a handmade card. On the front was a drawing of their new apartment, with Valerie and Lily standing out front, holding hands. There were flowers in the windows and the sun shining overhead. Inside, written carefully in Lily's neat handwriting, were the words, "You made our life better, Mama." Valerie stared at the card, tears blurring her vision. She pulled Lily close and held her tightly, her heart swelling with gratitude and pride. "No," Valerie whispered. "We made it better, together." That night, after Lily had fallen asleep, Valerie sat by the window, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. She thought about how much had changed in such a short time. The job at Tesla had given her stability. Project Uplift had offered her hope. But it was Lily, and moments like tonight, that gave her purpose. She thought about Keanu Reeves, his quiet generosity, his ability to see her when she'd felt invisible. She hadn't seen him in weeks, but his presence was everywhere, not in grand gestures, but in the small miracles that filled each day. The safe home, the steady paycheck, the promise of a future. Valerie knew she owed it to him and to herself to keep going, to make sure other people got the same second chance she did. And as she closed her eyes that night, she made a promise to pay it forward. Over and over again. Valerie Thornton had always believed she was just one person, insignificant in the vast world that had often overlooked her. But as she stood in front of the crowded conference room at Tesla's Nevada campus, she realized how wrong she'd been. Rows of chairs were filled with new faces. Single parents, veterans, young people aging out of the foster system. They all sat together under the bright lights of the Project Uplift orientation, each person holding the same hopeful anticipation Valerie had once carried. Now she was the one standing in front, offering them hope. 3 months ago, Valerie began, her voice steady but emotional, I was in your shoes, scared, unsure, and exhausted. And then someone believed in me. She glanced briefly toward the back of the room where Keanu Reeves stood silently, his hands in his pockets, watching her with the same calm presence he had shown her that night at Walmart. She still remembered the simple power of his words. Why not you? Now she said them again. Why not you? Meeting the new participants. After the orientation, Valerie stayed behind to meet as many people as she could. A young man named Tyrell shared his story about losing his job and housing after returning from military service. A woman named Shonda, a mother of 3, confided that she had been couch surfing for months after escaping an abusive relationship. Valerie listened, nodding, giving each person the time and attention they deserved. She promised to help, just as she had been helped. And she meant it. The support group for single mothers. A few weeks later, Valerie proposed something new to the Project Uplift leadership team, a dedicated support group for single mothers in the program. There's something different about being a single mom, she explained to Anna and the other coordinators. The weight you carry is unique. You're everything to your kids. You're the provider, protector, and the one who tucks them in at night. And when you're struggling, it feels like you're failing them, even when you're doing your absolute best. Anna had nodded thoughtfully. You're right, let's do it. The first meeting was small, just Valerie and 3 other women sitting in a circle at the community center, drinking coffee from mismatched mugs. But as the weeks passed, the group grew. They shared job leads, childcare options, and grocery hacks. More importantly, they shared hope. Valerie watched bonds form, friendships deepen, and women who had once been quiet and reserved blossom into leaders themselves. They supported each other at work and at home. They organized meal trains when one of them was sick. They babysat each other's kids during night shifts. And every time a new mother walked through the door, scared and unsure, Valerie greeted her with the same words Keanu had said to her. You're not alone anymore. Keanu's quiet visit. Months after Valerie had settled into her new role, word reached her that Keanu was visiting the Tesla campus. She'd heard he did this occasionally, quiet visits, never announced, never publicized. He'd check in with Project Uplift, visit the engineering teams, and sometimes just sit and listen to the cafeteria conversations. That day, Valerie was preparing documents in the operations office when she sensed a presence behind her. She turned and found him standing there, wearing that same humble expression she'd come to associate with him. Mind if I check in? He asked. Valerie smiled. You're always welcome here. They walked through the building together, Valerie explaining the recent expansions. She shared stories about participants who had gone on to start businesses, earn degrees, and even buy their first homes. At one point, they stopped near the main entrance. Valerie took a breath. I never thanked you properly. Keanu looked at her, his expression soft but direct. You don't have to. I do, she insisted. You changed my life. He shook his head gently. No, Valerie, you did the hard work. I just opened a door. Those words hung in the air for a moment, heavy with truth. Valerie smiled, blinking back the sting of tears. Then I'm keeping that door open. for as many people as I can." "I know you will," Keanu said quietly. Expanding Project Uplift. It wasn't long before Valerie proposed a bold new plan to Project Uplift's board, expanding their reach to include rural areas that had long been overlooked. Many of these communities lacked access to reliable jobs, healthcare, or childcare. Valerie's proposal was detailed, backed by data, and, most importantly, full of personal stories from the people she'd already helped. The board approved the expansion unanimously. Valerie led the charge, traveling to small towns in Nevada, Arizona, and even parts of rural California. She met families who'd given up hope and offered them not just resources, but dignity. Keanu quietly funded much of the expansion, ensuring no one was left behind because of budget limitations. But he never took the spotlight. When news outlets asked about Project Uplift, he always pointed to Valerie. "She's the reason this works," he said in one interview. "She knows what it's like to fight for a second chance." Valerie's reflection on her grandmother. One evening, after a particularly long day at a community outreach event, Valerie sat on the back porch of her new home. Lily was asleep inside, the soft hum of her breathing monitor giving Valerie peace. She held a photo in her lap, her grandmother, Rosa, standing proudly in front of the small grocery store she had once owned. Rosa had been the kind of woman who gave food on credit to families who couldn't afford groceries and made sure no one left her store hungry. As Valerie traced the edges of the photograph with her thumb, she remembered her grandmother's words. "Kindness is the seed that grows a forest." Back then, she hadn't understood. She thought it was just something sweet her grandmother said. But now, she saw the truth in it. One act of kindness from her grandmother had changed Keanu's life all those years ago. And Keanu had carried that kindness forward, passing it to Valerie. Now Valerie was planting seeds of her own. She looked out at the trees swaying in the breeze and smiled. The forest was growing. Emotional climax. Later that month, Valerie stood at a podium at the annual Project Uplift Gala. She wore a simple but elegant dress Lily had helped her pick out. The room was filled with people, supporters, participants, and staff, many of whom had once been on the brink of losing everything. Valerie took a deep breath before speaking. "I used to think that life just happened to you," she began. "That some people were lucky and others weren't. But I was wrong. Kindness isn't luck, it's a choice. And when someone chooses to believe in you, it changes everything." She glanced at Keanu in the front row. He gave her a small nod. "My grandmother taught me that kindness is a seed. And I've seen what happens when you plant enough seeds. You get a forest, a place where people can grow and thrive and shelter others." The applause that followed was thunderous. But Valerie didn't let it swell her pride. She smiled and stepped back from the microphone, knowing her words belonged to everyone in the room. The conference hall was alive with energy. Project Uplift's first national conference had drawn people from all over the country. Participants who'd found new purpose, community leaders eager to partner, and donors inspired by the movement's incredible momentum. Valerie stood near the entrance, watching attendees mingle over coffee and exchange stories that mirrored her own. Stories of second chances, of light breaking through long stretches of darkness. The sight filled her chest with a quiet pride. She had helped build this. And yet, something still tugged at her. A question that had lingered in the back of her mind since that night in Walmart when Keanu Reeves had handed her a simple black card and said, "I think we can help." Why her? Why then? As if summoned by the thought, Keanu appeared beside her, dressed casually in jeans and a black jacket. He had a way of blending in, even in a space where everyone seemed to gravitate toward him with respect and quiet admiration. "Quite the crowd," he said, giving her a sidelong glance and a faint smile. Valerie chuckled softly. "You could say that." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the conference unfold. Then, Keanu gestured toward a quieter hallway off to the side. "You have a minute?" They stepped away from the noise and found a bench under a wide window overlooking the courtyard. Keanu sat down, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands loosely clasped. Valerie followed, folding her hands in her lap, waiting. "You ever wonder why I gave you that card?" Keanu asked after a moment. His voice was quiet, but there was something deeper behind the question. Valerie nodded. "I have," she met his gaze. "I mean, I was grateful. I am grateful. But I've always wondered." Keanu exhaled slowly, as if releasing something he'd been carrying for a long time. "A long time ago," he began, "I wasn't doing so well. I was young, broke. I'd just lost someone close to me. I didn't have a home, I didn't have work, I was lost." Valerie watched him carefully. She had heard snippets of his past from interviews over the years, but this wasn't the polished, distant narrative he occasionally shared with the press. This was personal. "Oh, night," Keanu continued, "I ended up in a small town not far from here. I was hungry, and I didn't have a place to sleep. I sat outside a corner store just trying to figure out my next move, and then this woman came out." He smiled faintly at the memory. "She handed me a sandwich and a bottle of water, said I looked like I needed both. I thanked her, and I figured that was it. But then she said, 'Come on, you need a real meal and a place to rest.'" Valerie felt her breath hitch. She already knew where this was going, but she didn't interrupt. Keanu's gaze softened. "She took me back to her house, gave me a bed, fed me, treated me like family, no questions, no judgment. I stayed there for a few days. She made sure I was on my feet before I left." He turned to Valerie then, his expression tender. Her name was Rosa. Valerie's eyes stung as she blinked rapidly, struggling to stay composed. "Rosa Thornton," she whispered. Keanu nodded. "Your grandmother." Valerie covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders trembling as the weight of his words sank in. She had grown up hearing stories about her grandmother's kindness, how Rosa had always helped people in need, even when she had little herself. But she had never imagined that one of those people was Keanu Reeves. "He used to tell me stories," Valerie said, her voice thick with emotion. "She always said you should help people if you can, even strangers." She let out a shaky laugh. "I just never realized." Keanu gave her time to process it, his gaze never leaving hers. "I never forgot her, or what she did for me. When I saw your name on your badge that night at Walmart, I knew. And when you told me about Lily, I remembered Rose's words. She told me once, 'Kindness isn't about what you get back. It's about what you leave behind.'" Valerie wiped a tear from her cheek. "She said that to me too." Keanu smiled. "She changed my life, and I promised myself that if I ever got the chance to pay that forward, I would. So, when I saw you, it wasn't a decision, it was a promise." Valerie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "All this time, I thought you were just being, well, you. Kind. But it was her." Keanu shook his head gently. "It was you. You reminded me of her strength, her courage. You were doing everything you could for your daughter, just like Rosa did for your mom." He leaned back slightly. "This isn't about me. This is about what your family started. Rosa helped me stand. Now, it's your turn to help others." Valerie nodded slowly, tears still shining in her eyes but now accompanied by a small, fierce smile. "I will," she promised. "I won't stop." "I know," Keanu said quietly. They sat there for a while longer, the silence between them filled with understanding and connection that spanned generations. Later that evening, as Valerie prepared to give her keynote speech at the conference's closing ceremony, she stood backstage, holding her grandmother's locket in her hand. She had found it tucked away in an old jewelry box after Rosa had passed. Inside was a tiny photo of Rosa in her youth, smiling in front of her little store. Valerie smiled back at the photo now, her heart full. "We did it, Grandma," she whispered. "And we're just getting started." Keanu watched her from the wings as she took the stage, his expression full of pride. He knew she would carry this forward in ways he couldn't imagine, and that was exactly as it should be. As Valerie spoke, telling the story of how kindness had rippled from one woman's small act to a movement changing thousands of lives. Keanu listened. He didn't need to be in the spotlight. Rosa had already taught him that true kindness was quiet, steady, and lasting. And it had changed everything. The morning sun shone bright over Nevada, casting a golden glow across the new housing development that sat at the heart of the city's transformation. Rows of modest but well-built homes stood proudly on land that had once been a forgotten stretch of desert. Now it was called Rosewood Community, named in honor of Rosa Thornton, a name Valerie had chosen herself. Valerie stood at the podium in front of the gathered crowd, a large ceremonial ribbon stretched out behind her, ready to be cut. Her hand rested lightly on the wooden surface as she took a breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle in her chest. Not as a burden, but as something solid and true. A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth as her gaze swept the audience. These were families who had once stood where she had, single parents, veterans, workers displaced by life's unpredictable turns. Each one of them was here because someone had believed in them, because someone had opened a door, and now it was her job to keep that door open. 6 months earlier, Valerie had been offered the position of director of Project Uplift's Nevada branch. Anna had called her into a meeting, her tone warm but businesslike, and slid an offer letter across the table. "You're already doing the work," Anna had said, folding her hands on the table. "This just makes it official." Valerie had stared at the document, her name printed in bold letters at the top. It felt surreal. She had been terrified to sign it, afraid it wasn't real or that she wasn't ready. But then she thought of Lily, and Rosa, and Keanu. She picked up the pen. "I won't let you down," she promised. "You won't," Anna replied with certainty. Now, as director, Valerie oversaw hundreds of participants in the program. She worked with companies to create job opportunities, partnered with schools to offer training, and coordinated affordable housing initiatives like Rosewood Community. Every day, she walked into her office with a purpose she had never known before. One of the first things Valerie did after her promotion was move into a new home with Lily. It wasn't extravagant, a 3-bedroom house with a small garden and a porch swing that creaked in the wind. But it was theirs. The mortgage was manageable thanks to the program's support. Lily had painted her room in soft purples and blues, hanging fairy lights around her bed. There were shelves lined with books, toys carefully organized, and drawings taped to the walls. The house was filled with laughter in the evenings, the warm smell of cooking, and the quiet peace that came with knowing they were safe. Most nights, after homework was done and Lily was tucked in with her stuffed bunny, Valerie sat on the back porch and listened to the sounds of the neighborhood. Kids playing, dogs barking, sprinklers clicking on. Life. She often found herself thinking about Rosa, about how proud her grandmother would be to see this life, about how Keanu's kindness had planted the seed that allowed it to grow. The ribbon-cutting ceremony marked the official opening of Rosewood Community, the largest housing initiative Project Uplift had completed so far in Nevada. Valerie had spent months overseeing its construction, ensuring every detail honored the vision they had for dignity and hope. As she stood at the podium that morning, she glanced toward the side of the crowd. Keanu was there, as she knew he would be. He wasn't on stage, he hadn't wanted to speak, but he was there, standing quietly beneath the shade of an old oak tree planted near the entrance. Their eyes met for a brief moment. He gave her the smallest nod, one of quiet encouragement. It was all she needed. Valerie adjusted the microphone and took a breath. "Not long ago," she began, "I was standing in a checkout lane at Walmart, crying quietly, trying to hold my life together. I didn't think anyone noticed. I didn't think anyone cared." She paused, scanning the faces in front of her. Faces that were listening, really listening. "But someone did," she continued, "and that simple act, one person seeing me, believing in me, changed everything." She glanced down briefly at her hands, steady now, and then back at the crowd. "My grandmother used to say that kindness is a seed that grows a forest. We are standing in that forest now. Every home behind me is a tree, grown from belief, from hope, from second chances. There was a murmur of agreement, soft but strong. Valerie went on, "Project Uplift isn't just about jobs or houses or health care. It's about dignity. It's about giving people the chance to rise, not because they're lucky, but because they're worthy." She looked at Lily, sitting in the front row with her school friends, beaming with pride. "This community," Valerie said, "is just the beginning. And I hope as you walk through these homes and meet these families, you remember that each of them carries a story, just like mine, just like yours." The applause came, slowly at first, then built into something thunderous. Valerie smiled, feeling tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but not falling. Not today. After the speeches ended and the ribbon was cut, families began exploring their new homes. Kids ran across the freshly cut lawns, laughter ringing through the air. It was everything Valerie had hoped for. She found Keanu standing alone near the community garden. He was watching the scene with a quiet satisfaction, his hands still in his pockets, his posture relaxed. "Come to check on us?" Valerie teased gently as she approached. "Making sure you didn't need me anymore," Keanu replied with a wry smile. "I don't," Valerie said softly, "but I'm glad you're here." They stood together in companionable silence. "You've fulfilled your promise," Valerie said after a moment. "To Rosa." Keanu shook his head slightly. "No, you did that." Valerie didn't argue. She knew what he meant. As the day wound down, Valerie watched as families began moving in. She saw a little boy hang a welcome home sign on his front door. She saw a mother wipe tears from her cheeks as she turned the key in her lock for the first time. And she saw Lily running through the rows of houses with her friends, her laughter bright and free. Valerie knew this wasn't the end of the work. There was more to do, more families to reach, more seeds to plant. But today, standing in Rosewood Community, she allowed herself a moment to breathe it all in. A life rebuilt, a community reborn, and all because one man had noticed a cashier crying at the end of her rope and decided to open a door. The sun rose over the city skyline, casting long golden rays across the conference table where Valerie sat, a cup of coffee warming her hands. It was early morning at the Project Uplift headquarters, and the energy in the room was electric. Leaders from across the country had gathered, corporate partners, social workers, community advocates, all of them committed to one thing: expanding Project Uplift into a nationwide movement. Keanu sat at the far end of the table, quiet as usual, observing more than he spoke. His role had always been to empower others, not command attention. But Valerie could sense his quiet pride with each report shared, each success story told. It had been 2 years since Rosewood Community had opened its doors, and now Project Uplift was on the verge of transforming dozens of neighborhoods across the country. Valerie took a deep breath as she rose from her seat, clicking her remote to display the next slide. A map of the United States lit up the screen, peppered with colored pins, each representing a city where Project Uplift was already making an impact, or soon would. "In the last 12 months alone," she began, her voice steady with confidence, "we've opened 12 new community centers in 5 states. That's 12 hubs offering job training, affordable housing assistance, healthcare access, and childcare support. And we're just getting started." The applause was immediate. Valerie allowed herself a small smile before continuing. "Our next goal is to bring Project Uplift to 30 cities in the next 3 years. We've already secured partnerships with local governments, employers, and healthcare providers. We're building something that works, something that lasts." Keanu leaned forward slightly. "And something they own," he added. Valerie nodded in agreement. "Exactly. This isn't about charity, it's about empowerment. Every participant has a voice in how we grow. They're the leaders in their communities. We just give them the tools." One of the greatest honors in the expansion had been the opening of the Rosa Thornton Center for Single Mothers in Los Angeles. Valerie had insisted that her grandmother's legacy be part of Project Uplift's DNA. The new center was more than just a building. It was a refuge and a launch pad for women who needed support, just as Valerie once had. On opening day, Valerie stood in front of the bright blue entrance, her hand resting on the bronze plaque bearing Rosa's name. Lily stood beside her, holding scissors for the ribbon cutting, her smile wide and bright. "I wish she could see this," Valerie whispered to Keanu, who stood nearby. "She can," he replied softly. The ribbon was cut, and families poured into the building. Inside were classrooms for job skills training, play areas for children, private counseling offices, and a large communal kitchen where families could gather for meals. Every inch of the space was designed with dignity and hope in mind. Valerie could feel Rosa's presence in every corner. A few weeks after the grand opening, Keanu visited the Rosa Thornton Center without fanfare. He preferred it that way. No cameras, no media, just himself and a quiet tour through the heart of what he had helped inspire. Valerie met him at the entrance. "I'm glad you came," she said. "I wanted to see it for myself," Keanu replied. They walked the halls together, stopping in classrooms where single mothers learned new job skills, computer programming, financial planning, even culinary arts. In another room, young children played together, supervised by volunteers. The energy was warm and hopeful. As they passed the art room, a little boy about 5 years old tugged on Keanu's sleeve. "Mister?" the boy said, his eyes bright and curious. Keanu knelt down to his level. "Hey there." The boy handed him a piece of paper, a drawing done in crayon. Stick figures stood in front of a house, holding hands. Over them was a rainbow, and under it, written in a child's careful scrawl, were the words, "Thank you for helping my mom." Keanu took the drawing gently, his throat tight. "Thank you," he said quietly. He stood slowly and turned to Valerie, holding up the picture. "This," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "this is what matters." Valerie's eyes filled with tears. She took the drawing, smoothing it as if it were made of glass. "It really is," she whispered. As Project Uplift expanded, Valerie worked closely with regional directors, ensuring each new center met the unique needs of its community. In Detroit, they focused on trade programs to support the automotive sector's revival. In Appalachia, they emphasized sustainable farming initiatives. In Phoenix, they partnered with healthcare clinics to address chronic illness and provide mental health services. Each community was different, but the mission was the same: empower people, restore dignity, and create real opportunities for families to thrive. Keanu continued to fund the initiatives quietly. He never wanted recognition. Valerie often joked he was the ghost in the machine, the guiding force few saw, but everyone benefited from. And when he visited a new site, he was always welcomed like family. One late evening, Valerie sat at her desk in the Nevada branch headquarters. She looked over the reports. Hundreds of families rehoused, thousands placed in new jobs, countless children now in safe schools with proper health care. She turned to the bulletin board behind her desk, covered in photos. Smiling families holding house keys, children on their first day of school, and program graduates receiving job certificates. At the center was the drawing from the little boy at the Rosa Thornton Center. She ran her fingers over the paper, smiling. From that night at Walmart, when her tears had been invisible to everyone except one man, to this, a movement touching lives across the nation. She thought of Lily, now thriving in school, talking about becoming a teacher so she could help kids like Project Uplift helped us. She thought of Rosa, who had believed in kindness even when times were hard. And she thought of Keanu, who had kept his promise to a woman he barely knew by believing in a woman who had once lost hope. Valerie's favorite part of her work was visiting new centers. On one such visit to a center in Chicago, she met a young mother named Renee, fresh out of an abusive marriage, raising 2 children on her own. Renee had just completed a 6-week training course and was about to start her first job in years. As they sat together, Renee confided, "I didn't think anyone saw me. And then someone did." Valerie smiled, her heart full. "I know exactly how that feels." They hugged, and as they did, Valerie felt the same quiet certainty Rosa must have felt when she handed a sandwich and water to a struggling young man all those years ago. Kindness didn't end. It rippled outward. At the next leadership retreat, Valerie and Keanu found themselves walking the garden paths at Rosewood Community. Children played nearby as the two strolled, talking about the future. "Do you ever think about slowing down?" Keanu asked. Valerie laughed. "Do you?" Keanu chuckled. "Touché." She turned serious for a moment. "You know, I never imagined any of this. Not when I was standing in that Walmart, holding it all together with duct tape and prayers." He nodded. "You were always meant for this, Valerie. You just needed someone to remind you." They stood at the top of a small hill, overlooking rows of houses, gardens, and parks. Families gathered in the community square for a movie night, laughter filling the air. "This is your legacy," Valerie said quietly. "No," Keanu corrected, "it's ours." The Nevada sun hung low on the horizon, its amber glow spreading across the newly completed Project Uplift headquarters. The modern glass building shimmered, not from its sleek design alone, but from what it stood for: hope, dignity, and second chances. Valerie stood beneath a large oak tree at the center of the courtyard, holding a young sapling cradled in burlap. It was small now, thin branches reaching for the sky like eager hands, but she knew what it could become. With time, patience, and care, it would grow strong, just like the people gathered around her today. Lily stood beside her, shovel in hand. At 12 years old, she had grown taller, more confident. She wore a Project Uplift t-shirt and a bright smile that mirrored the hope they'd both fought so hard to reclaim. "Ready, Mom?" Lily asked, her dark eyes shining. Valerie nodded. "Let's do it." They dug together, hands working in sync. The crowd around them, families, volunteers, and staff, stood quietly, witnessing a moment that felt sacred. This wasn't just about planting a tree. It was about planting a promise for the future. The tree was a red maple, chosen for its resilience and fiery colors in the fall. It symbolized transformation, a fitting metaphor for everything Project Uplift had become. Valerie carefully lowered the sapling into the hole, guiding the delicate roots into place. Lily shoveled earth back over it, packing it gently. When they finished, they stood back and admired their work. The tree stood straight and sure, its small green leaves trembling slightly in the breeze. As they finished, the applause rose softly around them, but Valerie's eyes weren't on the crowd. They were on Keanu, standing off to the side beneath the wide canopy of another oak tree. He hadn't said much today. He rarely did at events like these. He preferred to observe quietly, his presence subtle yet powerful. Hands in his pockets, he gave her a nod. She returned it with a grateful smile. Later, Valerie took her place at the podium set up in front of the new building. Behind her, the sun dipped lower, turning the sky into a painting of gold and violet. She cleared her throat gently and began to speak. "When I first walked through the doors of Project Uplift, I was broken," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled briefly before she clasped them in front of her. "I was working night shifts at Walmart, wondering how I was going to feed my daughter and keep a roof over our heads. I thought no one saw me. I thought no one cared." She paused, letting the weight of those words settle on the crowd. But someone did. Someone who didn't have to. Someone who could have just walked away. Her gaze flicked toward Keanu again. His expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet knowing, a reflection of the countless times he had done the same for others. "That one act of kindness changed everything," Valerie continued. "Because when someone believes in you, really believes, it gives you strength you didn't know you had." She took a breath. "And today, we pass that strength on. This tree we planted is more than a tree. It's a symbol of second chances, of hope, and of the promise we make to each other. To never look away from someone in need, to never let them stand alone." There was a quiet murmur of agreement from the crowd. Valerie finished with a soft smile. "We're all here because someone believed in us, and it's our job to believe in others, to keep this going, to grow something lasting." The applause this time was louder, warmer. Valerie stepped back from the podium, heart full. As the crowd dispersed to mingle and celebrate, Valerie noticed Keanu slipping away from the gathering. He moved through the courtyard with his usual quiet grace, his motorcycle helmet tucked under one arm. She made her way toward him, weaving through groups of smiling families. She caught up just as he reached his black motorcycle, parked beneath the shade. "You're leaving already?" she asked softly. He turned toward her, his expression as calm as always. "I've done my part," he said. "Time to let you lead." "You've been leading all along," Valerie replied. "You just don't like to admit it." He gave her a small smile, one of quiet satisfaction. "No. I open doors. People like you walk through them." There was a pause between them, full of unspoken gratitude. Valerie reached into her pocket and pulled out the drawing from the little boy at the Rosa Thornton Center. She'd laminated it, keeping it close at important moments. "Do you remember this?" she asked, holding it up. Keanu nodded. "Of course." "He drew it for you," Valerie said, "but I think it's for all of us." He took it, studying the bright crayon colors, the stick figures under the rainbow, and the simple words, "Thank you for helping my mom." Keanu handed it back gently. "This is what matters." Valerie smiled. "Yes, it is." He swung his leg over his motorcycle, fastening his helmet. He paused for a moment, eyes scanning the headquarters, the families gathered, the children laughing. "Take care, Valerie," he said. And with that, the engine roared to life. Keanu rode off slowly at first, then picking up speed as he made his way down the long stretch of road leading away from the Project Uplift headquarters. Valerie stood there, watching until he was nothing more than a small figure disappearing into the horizon, the setting sun framing him in golden light. Later that evening, as the celebrations wound down and Lily played with the other children beneath the newly planted tree, Valerie sat on the bench beside it. She rested her hand against the slender trunk, feeling its rough bark. She thought about how far they had come, from tears at a Walmart checkout lane to this, a national movement helping thousands, soon to be millions. She thought about Rosa and her simple act of kindness that had rippled across decades. She thought about Keanu, his quiet strength and belief in people, and how he had fulfilled a promise not for recognition, but because it was right. Her heart full, Valerie whispered softly, "Sometimes all it takes is one person who believes in you." And as the stars appeared one by one in the vast Nevada sky, she knew they were just getting started. The air was cooler now, the evening wrapping around the new Project Uplift headquarters like a quiet promise. Families were beginning to head home, children holding tightly to their parents' hands, their laughter still echoing faintly in the background. Valerie stood by the freshly planted red maple tree, watching as Lily skipped ahead toward their car, carefree and happy. She rested her palm on the young tree's bark once more, grounding herself in the moment. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, she wasn't thinking about survival or the next step. She was thinking about legacy, about how a single moment of compassion, a brief choice to care, had become something much larger than herself. The journey from that night in Walmart to this very moment had felt impossible, but here she stood, proof that impossible things can happen when someone believes in you. And she wasn't the only one. Keanu had once told Valerie, "Sometimes all a person needs is someone to listen and someone to believe." She hadn't realized the full weight of those words back then, but now, watching Project Uplift transform lives across the country, she understood. Because what started with her grandmother Rosa, offering a simple meal and kindness to a struggling young Keanu Reeves, had rippled through generations. Rosa's kindness helped Keanu when he had no one else. Keanu, in turn, had reached out to Valerie when she thought she was invisible, and Valerie had made it her mission to continue that legacy, creating a movement that gave people dignity, purpose, and second chances. It didn't take grand gestures, it took compassion. A quiet moment in a grocery line, a conversation when someone needed to be seen, a willingness to open a door when someone else felt locked out. It was never about heroism, it was about humanity. For his part, Keanu had never wanted credit. Valerie knew that. She'd come to understand the heart of the man who had changed her life without ever asking for recognition. In one of their quieter conversations, he had told her, "You can't always fix everything, but you can stand beside someone long enough for them to find their strength again." And he had done exactly that. He hadn't fixed Valerie. He had stood beside her. He had opened a door, handed her the keys, and stepped back so she could find her own way through. That was his legacy, and he knew it didn't end with Valerie. It continued with every single person Project Uplift helped, every family who found their footing, every child who was given the chance to dream bigger. Valerie thought back to the women she met every day in her work. Women like Shonda, who escaped an abusive relationship and was now running a community garden that fed dozens of families. Men like Tyrell, who had returned from military service broken, but now mentored other veterans in job training programs. They were people who had once felt invisible, forgotten, overlooked, but someone had seen them. That was the greatest lesson Valerie had learned through it all. Pay attention to the people who seem invisible. Pay attention to the single mom quietly holding back tears as she bags groceries. Pay attention to the veteran sitting quietly in the back of the room. Pay attention to the elderly man who smiles but doesn't meet your eyes. Because sometimes, the next great leader, innovator, or healer is struggling in silence, waiting for someone to give them a chance. Waiting for someone to listen. Waiting for someone to believe. The tree Valerie and Lily had planted would one day grow tall and strong. Its roots already stretched deep into the earth, anchoring it in place. Just as Project Uplift had become anchored in the lives it touched. It was more than a program, it was a legacy. A legacy that began with Rosa. A legacy carried forward by Keanu. And now, one Valerie was honored to lead. She knew one day Lily might stand in her place, or someone else whose life had been changed because a door had been opened when they thought they were out of options. This was how kindness worked. It didn't end. It rippled outward. It grew. As the last rays of sunlight dipped behind the Nevada hills, Valerie whispered softly to herself, "Sometimes all it takes is one person who believes in you." And as she watched Lily laugh with her friends in the distance, Valerie knew their future was bright. Not because they had everything, but because they had hope, and because they were surrounded by people who had chosen to care. That was the true power of second chances, and that was the legacy they would keep building. If you believe in second chances and the power of kindness, hit like, share this incredible story, and subscribe for more inspiring stories that restore your faith in humanity. Because sometimes, one small act of compassion can change the world, and you never know when it might be your turn to open that door for someone else.